been asked to say a few words about the British experience of impact investment. We seem to have discovered this area ahead of others, and I would like to take you back to 2000 when the Social Investment Task Force was set up, and I began to work as its chair with its members to try to understand how we could improve the way in which we tackle social issues. All of us, even then, even more so now, had become aware of the fact that as standards of living improve, the gap between rich and poor, instead of reducing, just kept on increasing. And those who were left behind were left permanently behind, with no chance of escape from poverty and lack of education. Equality of opportunity had already in 2000 begun to be a bit of an empty phrase. What did it mean, equality of opportunity, if you were born into a family where both your parents had no jobs and might have a drug habit? And when I began to interview social organizations and to analyze the system within which our society in Britain was dealing with social issues, I discovered a number of quite surprising things. First of all, I discovered that philanthropy for 100 years or more had focused on the act of giving rather than on achieving social outcomes. It had typically helped non-profit organizations by saying to them, you can have money for 2 or 3 years, don't spend any on your overheads, and there's a sanity check, then go and raise money from somebody else. This had led to a huge social sector. In the UK, it comprises over 800,000 organizations, virtually none of whose constituents had achieved any scale at all. And I realized recently that numbers had been collected in the United States on this phenomenon, where in the space of 25 years, 50,000 companies had gone through $50 million of sales, and only 144 non-profits had. And in 2000, we began to ask ourselves, how can we do for social entrepreneurs and for social organizations what we've done, what I was privileged to be able to do through venture capital for business entrepreneurs. After all, the tech revolution was funded in large part by venture capitalists, and young entrepreneurs led it. What if we were able to do the same thing with social issues? In those days, it was obvious to me that I could do what I had done at Apex, which was to buy stakes in companies which had good prospects, to buy stakes in companies, but this time in the poorest 25% of the country. And that's how Bridges Ventures started. And if you fast forward 10 years, Bridges Ventures today manages over $500 million. Instead of delivering 10 to 12% net returns, it's delivered 15% plus. And we proved over the last decade that entrepreneurship really knows no social or economic or educational boundaries, that entrepreneurs in poor areas are just as highly or even more motivated than those in the mainstream economy, that the business models that you design in these poorer areas are more price sensitive from the perspective of the consumer and more investment effective from the point of view of the investor than mainstream investments. But that in itself wasn't going to answer the question that I was asking myself about the fragmentation of the social sector, what used to be called the third sector. And in 2005, when the government began to negotiate with the big banks here to take away from them bank accounts which had been separated from their owners for 15 years or more, I was asked to chair the Commission on Unclaimed Assets and to pick up one of the recommendations we made in 2000, which was that to answer this question about the funding of non-profits, we really needed financial innovation, and we needed, in order to achieve that, to create a social investment bank that would bring together people who understood both social issues and finance. In 2007, we created social finance, and by 2010, social finance had developed and implemented the first social impact bond. And I'd like to dwell on the social impact bond for a moment, because for the first time we had a breakthrough in thinking. And the breakthrough in thinking was to say, if you link the achievement of a social performance to a financial return, funded from savings that the government would make, then you gave social entrepreneurs and social organizations potentially the key to the financial markets. And the first social impact bond dealt with young prisoners. As you probably know, everywhere across the world, young prisoners reoffend within 18 months of release in very great proportions. Roughly 60 to 70% of them reoffend within 18 months of release. And we went to the Ministry of Justice and we said, look, we are going to suggest a new way to tackle this issue. You pick a prison, we will raise £5 million, we will fund 3 or 4 non-profits over a period of 7 years, and to the extent that we fail to reduce the rate of reoffending by 7.5%, then the money will be lost. But to the extent that we succeed in reducing the rate of reoffending by 7.5% to 15%, then government will pay back the £5 million and will pay an increasing yield on the social impact bond that will go from 2 to 13%, hitting the 13% at a 15% reduction. So investors stood to make a return if these non-profits were successful. The non-profits kept part of the return to help grow themselves. But the punchline was that government would be paying out between 1/3 and half of the saving that it would achieve in 1 year if these young people did not reoffend. Now, across the world, there are about 20 social impact bonds now. About 14 of them are in the UK, about half a dozen are in the United States, and Australia has launched one. Initially, people thought that prisoner reoffending was perhaps the only application. But today we see that social impact bonds have been implemented for homelessness, for adoption, for foster parentage, for youth at risk of unemployment, even for asthma in poor neighborhoods of Fresno, California, as well as recidivism. And there are countries now working on applications such as the early detection of diabetes, where Israel is designing a social impact bond as we speak. Based on the successes of Bridges and social finance and many of the other organizations which had come into being since the Social Investment Task Force in the UK, when the coalition came to power in 2010, it began to be interested in the idea of giving all of its unclaimed assets, which were expected to be of the order of £400 million. As you will find out in the future, the sums are actually going to be greater than that. And to persuade the banks to provide a couple of £100 million of additional equity to create the social investment bank that we had recommended. And I worked with Nick O'Donoghue, who had been at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, to submit a business plan to the government. And at the beginning of 2012, Big Society Capital came into being with £600 million of capital. And I became its non-executive chairman, and Nick O'Donoghue its chief executive. And fast forwarding since then, we can see that there is a huge demand for capital in the social sector. We have seen a number of social impact bond issues raised, and we have participated in those. But just as importantly, we've seen almost a dozen organizations become interested in launching social investment funds of one kind or another. Some are generalist funds which address all social issues. Some focus more on education or on employment or on health. But I think the message for all of you today is a very clear one. It's becoming obvious that investment to tackle social issues can apply to non-profits as well as for-profit companies. It's becoming obvious that the sums that could potentially be attracted to this form of investment are huge. In charitable foundations alone in the United Kingdom, there are £100 billion of capital. In the United States, there's $1 trillion. If we only manage to attract between 3 and 5% of this money, we would match at 3% all of the money being given away by these charitable foundations in a year, and at the 5% level, all of the money that's being given away philanthropically by charitable foundations in the United States. For those of you who come from the financial business, I would put it this way. We're in the process of creating a new asset class, one that can deliver, in addition to an important social return, a financial return of 7 to 10% a year. Not correlated with the stock market, going up and down with it, but depending on the improvement in literacy or the eradication of malaria or of sleeping sickness or attainment levels at school or a reduction in the dropout rate from school or any of the other issues, including reoffending that I have described. Potentially, we're on the brink of a revolution of social entrepreneurship. Just as 30 or 40 years ago, when I started out with venture capital, we were on the brink of a revolution in business entrepreneurship, which, it needs to be said, brought about the tech revolution. My hope is that this new generation of social entrepreneurs will bring about a social revolution that begins to give everyone in our society a chance. Thank you very much.